Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we are going to talk about the no frills flower offerings, the two korbanot mincha that get no oil and no frankincense, no shemen, no livona. And those are the minchat choteh and the minchat knaot. The minchat choteh is the mincha that is actually a korban chatat. If you remember, way back when, we learned about the korban oliviorid. The korban oliviorid is a kind of korban chatat that is brought on three different occasions. Could be that someone purposely or accidentally um, swore in order not to have to give edut, not to have to give testimony. Could be that someone accidentally went into the Beit HaMikdash when they were tamei, or accidentally ate kodshim, sanctified food, when they were tamei. Could be that someone accidentally lied in a shvua or did not fulfill their shvua. Again, those latter two would be shogeg cases, right? Out of some sort of ignorance, some sort of mistake, as opposed to on purpose. In all of those cases, the Torah in Vayikra chapter 5 describes the need to bring a korban oliviorid. The reason why this particular korban chatat is called a korban oliviorid is because it's olev yored. It can be given of more expensive materials, namely animals, or less expensive materials, namely not four-legged animals, but uh, birds. And if not birds, if someone doesn't have enough money for birds, then it becomes flour. So that's where we get our minchat choteh. So our minchat choteh, no shemen, no livona. And our minchat kinaot we can find in Bamidbar, Perek Hey, the mincha that is given from the sotah, the mincha of jealousies. Why double jealousies? So some say jealousy of the husband and also jealousy of God wanting to punish the man with whom she may have had an affair. But either way, no livona and no shemen. Now, the Mishnah in Menachot, Perek Hey, Mishnah Gimel, which is also found on Nuntet in Menachot, tells us that these two korbanot have something in common and lists the two of them together as not having shemen and livona, right? The Mishnah starts with Yesh not shemen livona, shemen velo livona, livona velo shemen, lo shemen velo livona, right? There are some korbanot mincha or menachot that require both shemen and livona, some that require one and not the other, or the other and not the one, and some that require neither. And at the end of the Mishnah, we get to minchat choteh uminchat kinaot lo shemen velo livona, right? The mincha of a sinner, meaning that particular korban oliviorid for someone who's too poor to afford either birds or four-legged animals for that korban chatat that they require, and the mincha of a sotah, lo shemen velo livona, no oil and no frankincense. So I actually want to know, how much should we be thinking about these two as a pair? The minchat choteh and the minchat kinaot. And I mean that in the sense of, how much should we be thinking about their lack of shemen and livona as being for the same reason, right? So I just want to point out that when the Torah describes the lack of shemen and livona in Vayikra Hey for a minchat choteh, it says the following: V'im lo tasig yado lishtei torim or lishnei bnei yonah, if someone can't afford to give birds, v'hivi et korbano asher chata, they're going to bring a korban, asirit ha'efa solet lechatat, they're going to bring a tenth of an ephah of choice flour, lo yasim aleha shemen v'lo yitin aleha levona ki chatat hi. Right? They should not put any shemen on it. They should not put any levona on it because it is a chatat. Now, what is that because it is a chatat trying to suggest to us? Let's leave that as an open question for now. When the Torah describes in Bamidbar chapter Hey the lack of shemen and livona for the korban mincha that is brought for a sotah, it describes it as follows: Vehivi ha'ish et ishto ela kohen. The husband brings his wife to the kohen. Vehivi et korbanat aleha, and he's going to bring an offering for her. Asiri ta'ifa, a tenth of ephah. Kemach seorim. It's going to be barley wheat as opposed to um, chita, as opposed to um, it's going to be barley flour, sorry, as opposed to wheat flour. Lo yitzok alav shemen. He's not going to put oil on it. V'lo yitain alav levona. He's not going to put frankincense in on it. Ki minchat knaotu minchat zikaron mazkeret avon. Because similar to how it said ki chatati before, this is because it is a mincha of jealousies. It is a mincha of remembrance. And what does it remember? It remembers wrongdoing. So it does seem like there's something in common between these two in that the explanation, it seems, for why we are not putting shemen or levona on seems to be key because it's such and such type of korban. In the case of the minchat chote, ki chatati, and the case of the mincha of the sotah, ki minchat kinotu. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that the Rambam, in his Mor Nevuchim, in his Guide for the Perplexed, actually connects this to a bigger point about korbanot in general. He says, "Dergot b'min hakorbanot be'etem ledirug hachet." Okay, the levels of the species of whatever korban is given actually matches up to the level of the sin. And he makes an overall statement, Da shebechol shehachit gadol yoter, kach korbanot misug pachot yoter. Says you should know that the greater the sin, the lower the status of the species that you're supposed to bring as a korban for that sin. And as part of that example, he names our two korbanot. So let's look at that for a moment. Says behet'em le'inyan zeh, to correspond to this general principle, huchseru hatiyuv v'habisum miminchat choteh v'chein miminchat sotah. And that is why there is nothing that fancies up. I know that's not real terminology, but that's what's coming to me for tiyuv, like making tov, right? Nothing that makes it fancier or nothing that makes it aromatic on the minchat choteh or the minchat sotah, right? Because kigam hi nechshedet al chet, she is also suspected of a sin. V'asar lahakrivutan b'shemen ulevona, and therefore the Torah prohibited us from giving these korbanot using shemen and levona, meaning it's part of the concept that the greater the sin, the lesser the status, or the plainer, I should say, the korban, right? He says a little bit more, hatiyuv hazeh husar mehen mishum she'amevi ota eino tov v'lo ba'al ma'asim yafim. The positive, whatever would have added something nice, namely shemen and livona, were taken away from these two because the person bringing it is not good. So you shouldn't bring something that's good, right? וכאילו הוא מומרץ לחזור בתשובה, ונאמר לו בשל רוע מעשיך קורבנך הוא במצב הפחות ביותר. Listen, you have to do tshuva. Your korban is kind of a nebuch korban because right now you're kind of nebuch too, right? And the Rambam adds even further for the sotah, the korbanah shel sotah shemaaseh ra'im yoter min hashogeg, and the situation of a sotah whose maasim are worse than shogeg, right? What he's really referring to is that general korbanot chatat are shogeg, and even the olav yored, 2 out of the 3 times it comes is because of a shogeg, and the sotah, we're not necessarily talking about shogeg, right? Asui mechomer pachut yoter. Moreover, the sotah, we mentioned that it was barley flour as opposed to wheat flour, right? Kihu kemach seorim, right? That's even kind of the lowest version. But what the Rambam did here is he brought together the reasons for not having shemen and levona on either of these korbanot. And it's not really that he came up with that on his own, because the truth is, when you look into Tosefta, In sotah, it tells us a reason why neither of these two should get shemen and levona. Kol ha-menachot shebetorah, in the first chapter of Tosefta Sotah, kol ha-menachot shebetorah te'unot shemen ulevona, chutz mi-minchat choteh minchat kinod. All menachot require, the way that I'm translating this is oil and or frankincense, except for the mincha of the sinner from Vayikra chapter 5 and the mincha of the jealousy from Bamidbar chapter 5. Right? Shinemar lo yizok aleh shemen v'lo yitin aleh levona, and then it quotes the pasuk from it quotes the pasuk from Sotah. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol chataot shebatorah ein te'unot nisachim. Rabbi Shimon says, well, actually, any korban chatat in the Torah never gets a libation, chutz mechatato v'ashamo shel metzora, except for the chatat and the asham, the sin offering and the guilt offering of the metzora. Why? Why should none of these things get nesachim generally? Now, it hasn't explained why the outliers are there, but generally none of them should get libation. Shelo yeh korban choteh mehudar. Because the korban of a sinner should not look nice. It shouldn't look nice. It shouldn't have extra things. It shouldn't have libations. It shouldn't have anything extra, right? And Yerushalmi actually talks about this and tries to figure out, well, okay, why do you even have these outliers of the Mitzorah? Why does that get nisachim? Why does that get libation? So Tani Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Yerushalmi and Sotah. Why did they say that all korbanot chatat, all sin offerings, and all korbanot asham, all guilt offerings, should not have a, wine libation with them? The korban of a sinner should not look nice. Hetivun, but then the response came, wait, Hare chatato v'ashamo shel mitzora. How come a mitzora? How come their chatat and asham get a wine libation? In Tamar she'eno chota, if you're going to say, well, they didn't do any sin. Ha'amar Rabbi Yitzchak zotia torat hamitzora, zot torat hamotzi shemra. Didn't Rabbi Yitzchak tell us that mitzora is actually a kind of elided word that stands for motzi shemra, somebody who has been telling false calumny about other people, meaning the mitzora is a sinner. So how could you allow there to be nisachim with their korban? Amar Rabbi La, mikivan shenityaser. Well, because this person has suffered, the mitzora or mitzorat has suffered, uchtiv, and the Torah tells us, v'nikla achicha le'einecha, right? We learn that after somebody gets malkot, we don't want to give them too much because v'nikla achicha le'einecha, we don't want them to become undignified in front of your eyes. We don't want them to be humiliated. Notice that this is a person who just got 39 lashes, and they're called achicha, meaning kimi she'en choteh. It's like someone who hasn't sinned anymore. So meaning the mitzora, yes, it's true that the assumption, the rabbinic assumption is that they sinned, and yet they still get a nesech, they still get nisachim, they still get libation along with their korban, because now that they have suffered, they are now at a clean slate, right? But notice, this is really trying to tell you something about korbanot writ large. You don't want korbanot that represents sin, that someone's bringing as a sin offering to be mehudar. Now, it's interesting because the Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, adds another layer, which is actually, you might have thought that if somebody did a sin, you would want them to have to pay more. So you'd want them to have to bring shemen and levona and, using the same logic, yayin nesach as well, right? Meaning niso chayayin, not yayin nesach as in yayin of avodah zarah that we're not allowed to drink niso chayayin as in wine libation for a korban. Rabbi Shimon says, "B'dinu shetehei minchat choteh tu'una shemen ulevona." Actually, we would have thought that by logic, you would require dafka, a minchat choteh, a sinner's mincha, to have oil and frankincense. Shelo yeh choteh niskar. I don't want the sinner to get away with something, meaning you're getting a benefit that you give a cheaper korban because you sinned, meaning if you hadn't sinned, you would have had to bring shemen and levuna, but because you sin, you get to bring something that's less expensive. No, that maybe we should require you to bring shemen and levuna along with it. But then the logic continues, "Mipnei ma eina te'una." How come it doesn't require that? "Shelo yehi korbano mehudar," because we really don't want their korban, we really don't want their korban to be nice, right? Like it shouldn't be that way. And then the Gemara in Menachot makes the same point about a korban chatat that by rights you would have thought that you'd have to bring a wine libation, but because kidei shelo yehei choten niskar, because we don't want someone to gain a financial benefit by sinning. But actually, the problem is shelo yehei korbano mehudar. We don't want it to be a nice korban, so we're not going to allow it, right? So there's a lot going on here. In addition, the Gemara in Sotah also talks about the fact that the minchat knot is made only of barley, right? Meaning it's a cheaper kind of korban. Again, going back to the way that the Rambam sets this up to basically say, hi, this is a concept in korbanot in general. The bigger the sin, the plainer the korban, right? We don't want it to be mehudar. So that applies to the minchat choteh, it applies to the minchat knot. However, there are sources that suggest that there may be a different reason for why the minchat choteh doesn't have a shemen and levona versus why the minchat kinaot doesn't have shemen and levona. And I think those are interesting also because it's just interesting to look into each one and how it connects to its own to the particular sin. So the Sefer Chinuch in Mitzvah 125, Mitzvah Kuf Kaf Hey, and also Mitzvah Kuf Kaf Vav, counts the mitzvot of the lo ta'aseh, the negative commandments of not putting Shem and Zayit on a minchat choteh and not putting levona on a minchat choteh. And he really explains the reasoning behind both of these mitzvot in the first listing. He says, Misharshei mitzvah, the roots of this mitzvah, lefi shemen remez lema'ala ulegdula, right? Shemen refers to status and greatness. She'ima tama arvo b'chol mashkim, because if you mix it with any other liquid, hutzaf al kulan, it will rise to the top. V'hu davar chashuv ma'od, oil is very important, it's distinguished. V'yaduahu chashivut shemen hatov, everybody knows the distinction of good oil, fine oil. V'lachein yimshechu bo hamitchanchim, or maybe yimashchu bo probably, hamitchanchim lema'alat malchuto kehuna, right? And this is why when you're inducting someone into monarchy or inducting someone into priesthood, they would, pour some oil on their head. Al kein ein ra'ui lateit mimenu b'minchat hachoteh hatzarich להראות בעצמו דאגה ושפלות על שבת דבר עבירה בידו. And for that reason, it's appropriate. It's not really appropriate for somebody who's a sinner, who's bringing a korban of sin that's actually supposed to reflect that they're worried, they're anxious, and they stand lowly before God because they sinned. It's not really appropriate for them to put shemen onto their korban. Now, this applies equally to the minchat choteh and the minchat knot, right? And I like the idea of, it's kind of an explanation of the shelo yehi korbano mehudar, right? That the korban should not be beautiful. Why should the korban not be beautiful? Because this person should not be luxuriating, right? But then the Sefer Chinuch adds something else, which I don't really know where it comes from, and the Menachot Chinuch doesn't know where it comes from either. It says, V'od nomar, he says, there's another explanation that I can give for why you don't put shemen and levona on a minchat choteh. Remember what a minchat choteh is. A minchat choteh is for someone who is too poor to afford a korban chatat, even of birds, right? In the situation of either having lied not to have to give edut, or having accidentally walked into the mikdash as tameh or eaten kachim when they were tameh, or having accidentally made a lying oath or not fulfilled their oath, right? It's a situation where really the person, if they had had enough means, they would have given a four-legged animal as their korban chatat for that. But the Torah made a special dispensation in those situations that they can do. If they can't afford that, they do birds, and if they can't afford birds, they do flour. So the Sefer HaChinuch says this is so simple. He says, "V'od nomar," I can say, "Shehu lechemla ta'ani." This is actually just taking pity on the person who can't afford. Shelo latricho yoter midai lavi shemen. You're not going to make somebody who can't afford to even bring a bird korban now bring oil. Doesn't make sense. Ki Hashem baruch hu lo yatriach birya. Hashem doesn't want to, you know, make it difficult financially to fulfill your obligation. Umipnei zeh, and for this reason, gamkin lo chivu rak b'ma'at kemach. That's why it's so little flour required. She'iev shal l'shum adam, she'afilu b'dalei dalut, below ma'at kemach. Everybody has at least a tenth of an ephah of kemach, right? V'zeh yaspik lanu gam ala levona. He says, same thing goes for the levona. So I love what the Sefer HaChinuch did here, because what the Sefer HaChinuch did is he added the possibility that the reason for not giving shemen for the Minchas Choteh is actually doing something nice for him or her. They don't have enough. They don't have enough money. So how could you possibly ask them to bring shemen? Now, if that's the case for the Minchas Choteh, is there a special reasoning offered for the Minchat Knaot not getting its shemen and livona? Well, I can tell you the suggestion made in Bamidbar Rabbah, which it's hard to know, Bamidbar Rabbah itself is medieval, but it's hard to know how early it might be quoting from. But it gives a specific reason for Minchat Knaot not being accepted if it has shemen or livona, okay, meaning the mincha sotah. So Bamidbar Rabbah says, "Lo yitzok alav shemen, lo yitin alav livona." No oil, no frankincense. Tani Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says this is the Rabbi Shimon that we saw before, right? B'dinu shdei minchat chotah tu shemen ulvona kidei shlo yeh chotah niskar. We would have thought that maybe you would force them to specifically bring with oil and with frankincense, because why should you have to pay less? Because you're a sinner. Umibnei ma ena, we dafka don't want that to happen. We don't want you to benefit from your sin. Umibnei ma ena teuna, why not? Why don't we say that they have to do it? Because shaloye korbanot mehudar, we don't want their korban to be beautiful. But the davar acher, another read, is lo yitzok alav shemen lama. Why should you not pour shemen on it? Shashemen ora la'olam. Shemen is light for the world, maybe because it's fuel, or shakatuv kra'o yitzhar. Scripture calls it yitzhar, which may come from the word sohar, a light, or maybe a stone that illuminates. V'hi ahavat afela. This woman loved darkness. Now, maybe what it means is she loved secrecy, right? Meaning she did something clandestine. She loved secrecy. Lo ye'ora b'minchata. There shouldn't be light in her mincha. So there's no shemen in there, because it's really reflecting what she did. V'lo yiten aleh levona, and there's no levona in there. Why? And this is fascinating. Shah levona zikaron le'imahot. Levona is supposed to be a remembrance of our matriarchs. Shene Amar, based on a midrash on Shir Hashirim. Elech li el har hamor, I will go to, the mountain of Mor, which is, it's myrrh, it's an aromatic, right? And Har Hamor, Elu Avot Haolam. The Midrash says this refers to the patriarchs. And then Ve'el Givat Halivona, and to the hill of frankincense, Elu Ha'imahot, this is the matriarchs. Vezo Persha Midarkehen, and this woman, in being a sotah, she has diverged from their path. Lo Yehe Zichronan Bekorbana, their zikaron, their remembrance should not be in her korban. Levona kruya zikaron, right? Levona is actually called a remembrance, right? Well, that's because in the Torah it says mazkeret, but we're gonna leave that for now. But the point that's being suggested here is that there is a specific reason why dafka minchat knaot should not be getting shemen, because light, should not be getting levuna because of the matriarchs. And in fact, if you look in Tzena Urena, Tzena Re'ena was, of course, the Torah book that women were meant to learn from, I guess a couple centuries ago. I think that's fair. I think it was 19th century, but I forgot to look it up. One should not pour oil on the flour, and I can only get the I have access to the Tzena Re'ena in English. Okay, one should not pour oil on the flour as they used to pour oil on other meal offerings, because she did her deed in the dark with a strange man. Therefore, one should not pour oil, which was used to illumine. It should be dark for the woman. They should also not put any frankincense in the sacrifice, because Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah were compared to frankincense. The woman has separated herself from Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah with her evil deeds. Now, it is interesting to consider that this Bamidbar Rabbah text that had connected Livona with the matriarchs had been quoted by Rashi as well. So it's not something that became sort of like a sideline marginal understanding. It's something that became a basic repeated understanding. But what we're left with here is we're clearly left with the concept that we have korbanot of all different types. Some korbanot are going to be of this animal, some korbanot are going to be of that flour, some korbanot are going to be of wheat, some korbanot are going to be of barley, some korbanot are going to be of male animals, some korbanot are going to be of female animals, right? Some korbanot are going to be four-legged animals, some korbanot are going to be two-legged animals. There's a lot of disparity within the way that the korbanot works. And I always find it interesting when we try to develop some sort of systemic understanding, which is much more Maimonidean, right? That's much more kind of the Rambam's way to try to develop a systemic understanding of what's going on here. Even though the Rambam also famously says, some of these details are more about discipline and divine convention than they are about having specific meanings. But the Rambam spends a lot of time trying to explain the meanings behind certain korbanot as well. So it's not all one way or the other. And there are a lot of ink has been spilled on that. Where does the Rambam look for reasons, and where does the Rambam say, no, this is just convention? It's the way you have to do it, but I don't have a reason for it, and I'm not sure there is or has to be an inherent reason for it. But I also think it's interesting to consider that sometimes when we say, oh, look, we have two korbanot, that both of which do not get a shemen or livona, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't get shemen and livona for the same reason. And it's to consider that the possibility of not getting shemen and livona for somebody who's giving a korban chatat, meaning a korban olive yored, because they can't afford it, and somebody's not putting shemen and livona in their frankincense, in their mincha, because they're a sotah and they've basically done things hidden in the dark and they've rejected the ways of the matriarchs, it just adds a little more color, I would say, to each one. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Certainly, Chazal, early Chazal, like Tosefta, Yerushalmi, Bavli, seem to support more what becomes the Maimonidean way of looking at this through a lens of a big systemic approach of the worse the sin, the plainer the korban. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.